مساء الخير على حضراتكم. Last time we talked about the historical context of Ibn Khaldun, the times of Ibn Khaldun, and we mentioned that these were actually terrible times characterized by disintegration, dissolution, and retreat, and that everybody knew this, and it was mentioned in private as well as in public. Political retreat as the main trait of the age of Ibn Khaldun wasn't only confined to the political field, but it was also a social retreat, and it was an intellectual retreat. Politically, we've witnessed the disintegration of the main political units that were bearing the Muslim civilization. Socially, we saw the tribal wars and how war became a permanent condition, part of the everyday life of the people living in these times. And intellectually, we saw that philosophy and logic became marginalized in the different schools of these times, and that even religious sciences and linguistic sciences were not studied from classical texts, but from summaries and commentaries. Now is the time to study the life of Ibn Khaldun, the events that formed his social and political experience. This is extremely important because the relationship between the historical context and the ideas of a certain thinker is not a direct one, but there is an intermediate factor. And this intermediate factor is the social and political experience of the thinker himself. And that is why we find certain thinkers, a couple of thinkers, living in the same era, living in the same country, however they differ in their theoretical orientations, in the topics they study, in the way they deal with things. This is because the effect of the historical context isn't the same on their ideas, but there is also the social and political and intellectual experience of the individual thinker. And the main core of this experience is the idea of suffering. How certain thinker suffers certain events. How the weight of these events come to bear on the personality of a certain thinker, and as such, this weight forms this personality or crushes such personality. As such, it is extremely important for us to study the life of Ibn Khaldun. The main source for studying the life of Ibn Khaldun is the autobiography that he left us. Its title is التعريف بابن خلدون ورحلته غربا وشرقا, and I think there is an English translation for that work. We can certainly rely on this text, but not solely to extract the main events that form the life of Ibn Khaldun. We must also rely on other sources of other thinkers, those who were contemporaries of Ibn Khaldun or those who came after him. Where was this autobiography written and why? This autobiography was written after he finished writing his main work, in Latin magnum opus, Kitab al-Ibar, which contains the main core of his political and social theories. That was during his stay in Cairo. This is not something strange because Ibn Khaldun in Cairo drew a lot of attention from different people, those who were admirers of his and those who were hostile to him. So this autobiography was, in the opinion of Dr. Abd al-Gabri, a kind of self-defense from the side of Ibn Khaldun. And this brings us to the reason behind writing this autobiography. Ibn Khaldun actually impressed his audience. Whether we're talking about the elite or the masses, he was of an impressive personality. His diplomatic style, the way he used the words, and his style of using the language, the wealth of his knowledge, the depth of his insights, the decisiveness of the decisions and the rulings that he issued as a judge. All this impressed the different people who knew him, and that is why he became so close to the ruler of Egypt known as Sultan Barquq. It is therefore expected that those scholars from different fields of knowledge, as well as statesmen, would feel jealous towards Ibn Khaldun, and he was the subject of their attacks that focused on his qualification and his integrity. If you remember, when we talked about Ibn Khaldun in Egypt, we said that he became the supreme judge according to the Maliki legal school, and he also had held his own lectures in Al-Azhar Mosque and in other mosques. So he attracted a big audience, and he had his followers. This brought on him the envy and hate of his opponents, whether we're talking about intellectual opponents or political opponents. That is why he wrote his autobiography. In this autobiography, he actually was very much concerned about introducing himself, the lineage of his family, the names of those professors of his, the kind of books he studied, the personalities he dealt with, the government positions that he occupied, the foreign missions that he carried out. So we can see that this autobiography focused on external events of his life. But the pages of this autobiography never dealt with the internal events, the psychological experience of Ibn Khaldun, his sufferings during the different events that he went through, during the different dilemmas and catastrophic events that he witnessed. And this is something that he must have had, he must have suffered, he must have lived psychological crises, and we will see from his life and the ups and downs that he witnessed in his life, the different turnings of his life, that this must have left an impact on him psychologically, but he never dealt with this aspect in his introduction. Why in specific are we studying the life of Ibn Khaldun? What element in his thought that we want to explain by studying his life and the events that he lived? One Iraqi thinker and historian, his name is Ali al-Wardi, always talked about the Khaldunian leap. Leap means jump. How Ibn Khaldun descended from the sky of the high sky of philosophy to the different walks of real life. That is to say, he moved from the concrete theoretical notions of philosophy to observing and contemplating social and political reality, whether in his era or in the preceding eras. The Khaldounian leap will become clear to us as we move ahead in the pages of his introduction, and as we see the kind of social analysis that he provides us with. And we will find a radical difference between his socio-political and economic analysis and the writings, for instance, of Al-Farabi in Al-Siyasa Al-Madaniyya or in Ara' Ahl al-Madina Al-Fadila. I'd like to refer you, as a part of the readings of this lecture, to that part of Ibn Khaldoun's introduction that we talked about last semester under the title في أن الظلم مؤذن بخراب العمران. I needn't repeat myself again, and you can go to your notes and you can go to the pages of the introduction that you photocopied last lecture, and I really urge you to do so. This will give you a taste of the kind of analysis Ibn Khaldoun was doing and how it differed much from the work of from the intellectual work of the philosophers. And here you can really grasp the Khaldounian leap. And since different researchers attributed the Khaldounian leap to different factors, we really need to reconsider the life of Ibn Khaldoun in order to see how his self-experience influenced the twists and turns of his thought. The life stages of Ibn Khaldoun. We need to go through the life stages of Ibn Khaldoun, and we will find that he didn't really go through a monotonous life, but that was a stormy kind of life, a turbulent life, and it contained a lot of varieties that enriched his social and political experience. The first stage of his life was related to his childhood and education. Ibn Khaldoun, Abdurrahman ibn Khaldoun, was born in Tunisia in the year 732 of the Hijri calendar. He belonged to a family of notables, a very prestigious family of Yemeni origin from the Yemeni city of Hadramaut. And his ancestors actually immigrated from Yemen, and they lived in Andalusia, and they were part of the political elite. They occupied several key governmental posts, political and administrative, in Andalusia. But when different cities and regions in Andalusia fell in the hands of the Christian Spaniards, his family immigrated from Andalusia to Al-Maghrib. Please do not forget that when we mention the term Al-Maghrib, we do not mean just Morocco, but what we call Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya nowadays. So his ancestors were actually men of state, politicians, governors, but also men of literature and scholars and scientists, whether they were living in Andalusia or in Al-Maghrib. His father was a Maliki faqih who abstained from assuming any governmental post, and he sufficed himself with the social prestige of his family. He was very much interested in philosophy and logic, poetry and language, and his house was actually a meeting place of the cultural elite in the city of Tunis at that time. That was the family of Ibn Khaldun, and that was the house in which he was brought up. As for the child, Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun, he received a traditional education, the kind of education that was dominant in these times. At first, he memorized and studied the Quran, the different readings of the Holy Book, and then he moved to studying different branches of religious knowledge, Quranic commentary, prophetic tradition, fiqh, and then he moved to sciences of language, grammar, literature, and poetry. And in this stage of his life, there was actually, no uniqueness about his ideas and his thought. He was just a young man in the age of 16. But the start of an intellectual career, the budding of his mind came because of the friendship of his father to one of the biggest philosophers of these times. His name was Abu Abdullah al-Abili. That was a friend of the father of Ibn Khaldun. Abdurrahman Ibn Khaldun admired very much that friend of his father, and he was very close to him, and he studied under his guidance philosophy and logic. And in one of the works of Ibn Khaldun, he describes that man with the following terms: Al-Imam al-Kabir, Al-Alim al-Allama, Hujjat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, Mabda' al-Ma'arif wa Khatmuha. As a result of such relationship, Ibn Khaldun consecrated his time to studying philosophy and its different branches, mathematics, physics, logic, metaphysics, or theology, and he admired very much his teacher Al-Abili as much as he admired philosophy. We need to make a certain observation here, that the opinion of the young Ibn Khaldun in philosophy will not stay the same, will not remain the same, but it will be different from the opinion of the old Ibn Khaldun. When Ibn Khaldun wrote his introduction, there was a chapter with the title إبطال الفلسفة وفساد منتحلها, in which he actually criticized philosophy as an intellectual project, in which he attacked the main ideas of political philosophy, those ideas that we studied with in the lecture of Al-Farabi and his political regimes. As to the philosophical works that Ibn Khaldun studied under the supervision of Al-Abili, we find several key works at that time that exposed Ibn Khaldun to the different aspects of philosophical thought in the lands of Islam, despite his young age. Some of these works were كتاب المحصل لفخر الدين الرازي، الإشارات والتنبيهات لابن سينا، وبعض تلخيصات ابن رشد لكتب أرسطو. Ibn Khaldun remained for 3 years studying philosophy and logic under the supervision of his father's friend Al-Abili. But at that time, a disease spread throughout Tunis, an epidemic like the one that we are witnessing nowadays, which was the plague. The plague swept Tunisia, and it led to the death of several thinkers and scholars in Tunisia. Even the parents of Ibn Khaldun perished because of the plague. The estrangement and emptiness that Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun felt because of this led him to immigrate from Tunisia to Morocco, especially that his mentor Al-Abili moved to the court of the Sultan of Fes in Morocco. There is something I really want to mention here, is that part of our ability to understand Ibn Khaldun as a thinker, his ideas, his life, his social and political experience, is when we are able to go deep in what he went through. So, for instance, when we talk about the plague, destruction, fear of death, feelings of estrangement, the desire to leave or to immigrate, to flee, all these feelings we can really recognize because of what we are suffering from at this present moment, at our present moment. So I really don't want you to miss the point that part of our ability to understand a certain thinker is to identify common elements between our times and his times. These common elements constitute the bridge that we cross from our times to his times, from our thought to his thought. However, we should not impose our ideas and our problems and our topics on him. Otherwise, we will distort his theoretical structure and the system of his ideas. Now we are in the year 755 in the Hijri calendar. Ibn Khaldun is 23 years old. He immigrated to Morocco, to the city of Fes, which was under the authority of a tribe known as Bani Murrain, and he was working for the Sultan of Fes as a writer. So he was part of his administrative apparatus. That was a job that really didn't satisfy the political ambitions of Ibn Khaldun. He thought that this job is beneath him and that he is high above such a job. He tells us that beside his job, he actually was reading, he kept reading and studying, and he kept meeting several scholars, whether they were residents of Al-Maghrib or immigrants from Andalusia. Among them was his former mentor Al-Abili, and there was a mixture of those who were interested in philosophical sciences as well as religious sciences and also sciences of language. That stage of Ibn Khaldun's life was actually the formative stage. And here we can say that Ibn Khaldun in this stage received a fair part of his education, whether in religious sciences or in philosophy. The second life stage of Ibn Khaldun, that we can give it the title Ibn Khaldun and His Political Ambition, it started with his move to the city of Fes, to becoming part of the Sultan's court in the city of Fes. We need to say that the city of Fes wasn't just a city of science, poetry, and literature, but it was a city of politics of government, a city of conspiracies and intrigues. As such, the entourage of the Sultan of Fas wasn't only formed from men of letters, fuqaha, and scholars, but it was formed from men of politics and men of government, men of state. Those were originally from Al-Maghrib or from Andalusia. Some of them were actually free men. Some of them were actually a sort of asylum seekers. And some of them had his stay confined to the city of Fas. And I'll explain this right now. In the city of Fas, Ibn Khaldun was introduced to one prominent personality that will play a crucial role in his life, and that was Muhammad ibn Abi Zakaria al-Hafsi, the Prince of Begay. Begay is a city in Algeria. And whenever I mention him, I will say the Prince of Begay. We needn't bother ourselves with the names, because we will find a lot of names, a lot of about military leaders, ministers, politicians, princes who were introduced to Ibn Khaldun, and he had a lot of friends in this political aristocracy. Now, what is the story of this Prince of Begay? He was the ruler of an independent ruler of the city of Begay. But the Sultan of Fas has this idea that he should unite the whole Maghrib under his authority. As such, he went to war with the Prince of Begay, and he forced him to abdicate his rule. He forced him to surrender his authority. And he took the Prince of Begay from Algeria to live with him in the city of Fas, to be part of his entourage. And he did not allow him to leave the city of Fas. As such, he was actually confined. You can't say he was a prisoner, because he was not put in prison, but he had he wasn't under any sort of house arrest, but he was confined in the city. Now, Ibn Khaldun befriended the Prince of Begay, and their friendship became very strong. And the news flew to the Sultan of Fas. It was rumored that the Prince of Begay intended to flee the city of Fas in order to return to Begay and restore his authority, with the help of Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun, because the Prince of Begay promised Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun with a key government post when he restores his authority. That governmental post is called Al-Higaba. Al-Higaba is like the premiership, is like being the prime minister nowadays. But these were not just rumors, but these were actually real news, because the political ambition of Ibn Khaldun flourished in the court of the Sultan of Fas, and he was very keen to help the Prince of Begay to flee Fas in return to having this post of premiership. As such, when the Sultan of Fas learned that Ibn Khaldun befriended his rival, the Prince of Begay, and intended to help him to flee his confinement, he sent Ibn Khaldun for 2 years in prison. That was the first catastrophe that befell Ibn Khaldun in his life. That was the first dramatic event in his political career. Ibn Khaldun stayed in prison, and he didn't come out of prison except after 2 years, when the Sultan of Fas died. There is something I want to mention here before we continue. I'd like you to bring a map and to locate the cities in which Ibn Khaldun lived, and you can see the voyages that Ibn Khaldun made and how he moved from one city to the other, and you can see the distance between the different cities. As such, he was really kind of an adventurer, political adventurer, and he was always on the march, he was always on the move. Now, Ibn Khaldun came out of prison when the Sultan of Fas died. There was a change of government several times after the Sultan died, and every time the new ruler sought the help of Ibn Khaldun, either to assume authority or in order to strengthen his relationship with the Bedouin tribes. So, after the death of the Sultan, a man called Mansur ibn Sulaiman assumed authority, and Ibn Khaldun served him in his post, Diwan al-Kitaba, and then the brother of the former Sultan, his name is Abu Salim, and he was helped by Ibn Khaldun to reach authority. And Ibn Khaldun also served him. He assumed a certain judicial post. Then after that, Abu Salim was killed, and one of the leaders of the tribe of Bani Murrain assumed authority. That leader was called Al-Wazir Omar, the minister Omar, and he was an old friend of Ibn Khaldun. Now you see the amount of friendships that Ibn Khaldun cultivated during his stay in the court of Fas. Now, Al-Wazir Omar offered Ibn Khaldun an increase in his salary and increase in his financial privileges, an increase in his governmental tasks. But actually Ibn Khaldun refused. That was not up to the expectations, the political expectations of Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun asked him to allow him to go to Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya, it means that Algeria and Tunisia nowadays, but mainly Tunisia. But that minister actually refused. As such, Ibn Khaldun chose to go to Andalusia to serve in the court of the Sultan of Granada, the remaining Muslim region in Andalusia. Now, before we move with Ibn Khaldun to Andalusia, we need to say something. That Ibn Khaldun chose to go to Andalusia to serve the ruler of Granada because actually he was a friend of that ruler. That ruler was in exile in Fas when Ibn Khaldun was part of the court of the Sultan of Fas. So he befriended that prince, and he befriended an exiled minister of that prince. His name is Ibn al-Khatib. So when that prince restored his authority in Granada and took his minister with him, Ibn Khaldun found them key and useful allies and friends when he was in time of trouble. And that will happen several times in the life of Ibn Khaldun, and that was kind of a habit that the members of the political aristocracy in the Maghrib, they helped one another, and it was a common occurrence that they would occupy a certain position of authority, then they would be fired from that position of authority, and they seek refuge in another city where they have friends in position of authority. It was a common practice, as it seemed. Ibn Khaldun arrived in Andalusia in the year 764. That is after spending 9 years in the service of the Sultan of Fas and those who came after him. He was well received by the Sultan of Granada. He became part of his entourage, and he became his counselor. Next year, the Sultan of Granada sent Ibn Khaldun on a foreign mission to the King of Castile. The King of Castile was known as Pedro the Ruthless. There were wars between Granada and the city of Castile, so the Sultan of Granada wanted to hold peace talks with the King of Castile, and he put Ibn Khaldun on top of this foreign mission. When Ibn Khaldun went to the Christian King of Castile, he impressed him very much, and that king had a doctor, a physician, who actually treated him, who knew Ibn Khaldun, who was his friend from the time he was in Fas. Here you see how Ibn Khaldun cultivated several friendships when he was in Fas, and how Fas was a center of several personalities, cultural, intellectual, political, military, and all these came into contact with Ibn Khaldun. So because of this physician, the king of Castile, Pedro, knew who Ibn Khaldun was, knew that his ancestors lived in Andalusia. As such, when he became impressed by Ibn Khaldun, he offered him to stay in Castile and to be part of his court, and he promised him to return all the lands of his ancestors to Abdurrahman Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, as it seems, knew that this offer wasn't serious, so he actually refused that offer, and he returned to the service of the Sultan of Granada. But due to the closeness of the relationship between himself and the Sultan of Granada, he actually provoked the jealousy of the minister of the Sultan, who was also a friend of Ibn Khaldun, called Ibn Khatib, who was introduced to Ibn Khaldun when he was exiled in Fas. Ibn Khaldun didn't really want to bother his friend Ibn al-Khatib, but his influence and political power were growing in Granada to the extent that annoyed Ibn al-Khatib. Now the solution of the problem came from heavens. If you remember, the Prince of Begay, who was confined in the court of Fas and who was a friend of Ibn Khaldun and wanted to restore his authority in Begay. Now we left that person when Ibn Khaldun went to prison for 2 years in Fas. Now it seems that this Prince of Begay was able to flee Fas after the death of the Sultan, and he restored his principality, his authority in the city of Begay. And when that was done, he remembered his old friend Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun. As such, he sent him an invitation in Andalusia to come to Begay and assume the post of premiership. There are two remarks that we need to make about this life stage of Ibn Khaldun. The first remark is that the political ambition of Ibn Khaldun grew to unprecedented levels, to the extent that Ibn Khaldun wasn't really satisfied with the posts offered to him or to increases in his financial privileges. He wasn't satisfied with anything less premiership, al-hijaba. Why this post in specific? That was the key government post at these times. Al-Hajib, or the premier, was actually the link between the ruler and the people. As such, he was on top of the administrative apparatus. And at the same time, this position wasn't liable to any danger because of the political turbulence of these days. And it happened several times that when a new ruler came to the city, the premier submitted his authority to him, and the new prince or the new ruler allowed him to remain in his office. As such, it was a very influential position, and it was immune to the danger of change. Also, in this life stage, Ibn Khaldoun was able to finish his religious and philosophical studies. Not only this, but he actually read a lot in the political literature of the in the political works of the Sultanistic literature. If you remember, when we talked about the Sultanistic literature, we dealt with this work, الشهب اللامعة في السياسة النافعة لابن رضوان. Ibn Radwan was a friend of Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Khaldun read parts of his work. He must have read one of the key works of the Sultanistic literature at these times, entitled سراج الملوك في معرفة الملوك للطرطوشي. Also another work that was by mistake attributed to Aristotle. It was entitled كتاب السياسة في تدبير الرئاسة. And that is why in the introduction of Ibn Khaldun, when he criticized the Sultanistic literature, he made deep and incisive points of criticism of a person who was well read in this sort of literature. But the experience of Ibn Khaldun in philosophical sciences and in political science wasn't theoretical, but he was exposed to the winds of political life. When he was in Fas or in Granada or in Begay, he mixed with politicians, he mixed with statesmen, he mixed with Andalusian exiles, he mixed with tribesmen. As such, he saw, he didn't just read about politics, but he witnessed political intrigues. He witnessed political ambitions and how they materialized in certain persons assuming authority, and how after this they were overthrown from their posts, and the different changes that took place after and before. In other words, Ibn Khaldun, in this stage of his life, was very close to politics or the political field, whether from the side of practicing politics or from the side of studying and reading about politics. It was mentioned, and that is the third remark, in one of the works of Ibn al-Khatib, who was writing a book of history on Akhbar Gharnata, and he mentioned, there was an entry in that book on Ibn Khaldun. He mentioned that Ibn Khaldun stopped studying or reading in philosophy. Now please try to read that phrase with me. علق للسلطان، علق يعني كتب تعليق، أيام نظره في العقليات اللي هي الفلسفة، تقييدا يعني كتابا مفيدا في المنطق. Please observe that expression, أيام نظره. It means that when he was in Andalusia, he wasn't studying philosophy, but philosophy during his stay in Andalusia was a thing of the past. It means that Ibn Khaldun stopped studying philosophy before he came to Andalusia. Now the question is why? And the question is, was that a temporary stop in studying philosophy, or that was going to be something permanent? And if it was going to be something permanent, what is the reason behind it? And certainly we can seek the help of his introduction, and we can see how this was a start of a change in his attitude of philosophy, from admiring philosophy very much during the time when he was studying under the supervision of Al-Abili, to renouncing philosophy, as we can see in the time when he was writing the introduction of his work. That must have started in this phase. The third life stage of Ibn Khaldun was actually the turning point. We left Ibn Khaldun on the shores of Andalusia, taking the ship to the city of Begay, and he must have been very happy because the invitation of the Prince of Begay rid him of a very awkward situation in which he found himself with his former friend Ibn al-Khatib. Now he arrived in Begay, and he was well received by the Prince of Begay. He assumed the post of premiership, and Ibn Khaldun sat on the chair of authority, and he started managing the affairs of this principality, and he was a good politician, so he was able to quell the revolts and the seditions intelligently and decisively. Yet at the same time, he held his lectures in the mosque of the city, and he had a great audience during his lectures. One, because of the eloquence of Ibn Khaldun. Two, because he was the premier of the city, so everybody wanted to make friends with the premier. At this moment, we can see that Ibn Khaldun reached the peak of his political career, then that he satisfied his burning political ambitions. At last, he reached the highest level of authority after the prince, which is the premiership. Unfortunately for Ibn Khaldun, the Prince of Begay entered into conflict with his cousin, the Prince of Constantine, another Algerian city. And it seems that the Prince of Begay raised heavy taxes against his own population. As such, the people responded positively towards the inciting of his cousin, and they revolted against him. The conflict turned into a battle between the two cousins, and finally the Prince of Begay was killed, and his cousin, the Prince of Constantine, assumed the authority on Begay. Before the Prince of Constantine entered Begay, some of the people surrounding Ibn Khaldun, who was the premier for the killed prince, advised him not to surrender authority to the new prince, but to install one of the sons of the killed prince as a figurehead, and to become himself the holder of authority. But Ibn Khaldun actually refused this suggestion, and he surrendered the city to the new prince, who actually ordered Ibn Khaldun to remain in his position as a premier. Now, how do we explain this decision of Ibn Khaldun? Now, from the perspective of the political ambitions of Ibn Khaldun, he should have accepted that suggestion. Why did he refuse it then? He refused it because when we read the pages of his introduction, we will find that one of the main ideas of Ibn Khaldun, that a person of authority must enjoy the support of his own asabiyya, of his own tribe. And Ibn Khaldun knew quite well that he didn't enjoy such a thing, that the late Prince of Begay and the new prince, they had one tribal base, a divided tribal base, but it was ready to unite against any contender of authority. And that Ibn Khaldun didn't really enjoy a tribal support. His family was a prestigious family. Members of his family occupied governmental posts in Al-Andalusia and in Algeria, but on the ground, in terms of man-to-man power, in terms of the number of young fighters with arms that we talked about when we were talking about the social structure of the tribal society. What does that mean? It means that Ibn Khaldun can only play a second role in a hierarchy of authority, but he can never assume the first role. And if he ignored this important fact, he will be overthrown and killed. Please do not forget that a prince was liable to be killed by his opponents, but a minister or a prime minister, he will be just removed from office. Maximum, he will be imprisoned for some time, and then he will be released. And that is why Ibn Khaldun refused such a suggestion. After this, Ibn Khaldun felt a change of heart from the new prince because of the intrigues of his opponents. As such, he asked the new prince the permission to leave the city of Begay. At the start, the new prince granted him that permission. However, he had second thoughts, and he arrested him as well as his brother. And not only this, but actually he sent his troops to search the houses of the Khaldoun family, and they confiscated whatever money and goods they found in these houses. Why did the prince do this? The prince did this because he must have thought that Ibn Khaldun wanted to leave the city in order to incite and provoke the tribes against him, and that he must be in league or in agreement with one of his rivals, or that he himself wanted to assume authority. As such, in his second thoughts, he must have wanted to eliminate such a danger. Now, that is the second catastrophe that befell Ibn Khaldun in his political career. And because Ibn Khaldun says different things about it, this event is open to interpretation. One interpretation for it was made in terms of its impact on the psychology of Ibn Khaldun and his personality and attitude towards politics. One interpretation is that of Dr. Abid al-Gabri, and he thinks that this event had a terrible effect on Ibn Khaldun and constituted a turning point in his political thinking. And it was at this moment that Ibn Khaldun decided to quit politics. However, leaving politics or quitting politics is much more difficult than entering the political domain. Another thinker, an Egyptian scholar, his name is Abdullah Hanan, he thinks that this is only one of the adventures of Ibn Khaldun, and like the ones that preceded it, it only revealed the psychological traits of Ibn Khaldun, his selfishness, his ingratitude, and his opportunism. In one term, the Machiavellian nature of Ibn Khaldun. And he thinks that after it, Ibn Khaldun returned to the political field, and he made some adventures, even after announcing his intention to quit politics. Whatever the interpretation of such event might be, it is clear that Ibn Khaldun started quelling his political ambition, and he actually dedicated his time to reading and studying. In his own words, he says, فأعرضت عن الخوض في أحوال الملوك. أعرضت عن الخوض. khawd in terms of words or in terms of deeds. وبعثت الهمة على المطالعة والدرس. It means that I strengthened my intention to read and to study. As such, when he was offered the post of premiership by the Prince of Tilmisan, another rival of the Prince of Constantine, the new Prince of Begay, he refused that post. However, he said he sent his brother Yahya in his stead to be the premier for the Prince of Tilmisan. And he responded positively to the invitation of the Prince of Tilmisan, who sent him on a mission to incite and provoke the Bedouin tribes against one of his rivals. As such, we can see that Ibn Khaldun's quitting of politics was not complete, and that he was recalled from his solitude once and again in order to incite the Bedouin tribes or win them in favor of that prince or the other, and in order to forge new relations between the rulers of such cities and such regions for their different political purposes. At certain times, Ibn Khaldun incited the Bedouin tribes against a certain prince, and shortly afterwards he incited the same tribes against his rival and with the former prince. The changes in the balance of power between these rival princes made Ibn Khaldun change his loyalty several times from one prince to the other. So it is difficult for us to trace on whose side Ibn Khaldun was standing. He was always shifting his loyalty from one prince to another. As such, he was actually vulnerable to persecution, and he was always chased by the troops of such princes and arrested. However, he was very eloquent and he was very diplomatic, and he was able to find his way out of these problems by shifting his loyalty to the new prince. So it is very difficult for us to trace the different political events. Who is against whom, who won, who was defeated, who is the ally of Ibn Khaldun, who was the enemy of Ibn Khaldun. However, it was in this period that the idea of confining himself to studying, to reading, to research, and to writing matured in the mind of Ibn Khaldun. That was an idea that was always coming to the surface whenever political matters became turbulent and whenever he was facing dangers. And after the doors of the key cities in the Maghreb were closed in the face of Ibn Khaldun, he intended to go to Andalusia. However, the Sultan of Granada returned him this time to Morocco instead of surrendering him to the ruler of Fas, who really wanted to kill Ibn Khaldun. Now you can see the amount of hostilities that balanced the amount of friendships that Ibn Khaldun was able to cultivate. And this always happens to the person who goes through politics, who plays politics. He will always make friends and he will always make enemies. Sometimes the number of friends will outnumber the number of enemies. Sometimes it's the opposite. Dr. Abid al-Gabri thinks that there are two things to be said about this life stage of Ibn Khaldun. That his social and political experience became so rich to the extent that it became the main source of his thought. That Ibn Khaldun actually lived the luxurious life of palaces, and he enjoyed a very easy and easy in economic terms and happy life, a very comfortable life. And he mixed with the ruling aristocracy in the different Moroccan and Andalusian cities. Yet at the same time, he also mixed with the poor people of the Bedouin tribes when he took refuge in their midst, or when he was negotiating with them their loyalty to one prince against the other. As such, he became so close to them to be able to observe their habits, their traditions, and their lifestyle. In terms of Ibn Khaldun himself, Ibn Khaldun was able to witness Al-Umran al-Hadari wal-Umran al-Badawi. And he was able to observe the differences between the lifestyle of the city people and the lifestyle of the nomadic people, of the Bedouins. And this contradiction was actually the main drive of several events, social and political, in Muslim history. The second remark is that it was in this stage of Ibn Khaldun's life that the idea of isolation and confining himself to study and reading alone and quitting politics materialized in his thought. Whether this was related to the catastrophe that befell him after the death of the Prince of Begay, when he reached the peak of his political career, or that was the end result of the different military and political events that he went through in this stage of his life, which led to his disdain from politics, as well as the consolidation of a certain Sufi yearning in his heart. For instance, when we look at one of the letters that he sent to his friend Ibn al-Khatib, he talks about politics and political ambitions as a disease, and a recurring disease. And he mentions in the same letter several several Sufi mystic terms like al-mujahada, al-riyada, al-basair, al-maqamat, al-irfan, al-wusul. He even mentions that he dedicated most of his time to praying beside one of the shrines of a Sufi mystic, a dead Sufi mystic. His name is Abu Madian al-Ghawth. Now we come to the last life stage of Ibn Khaldun, which is the stage of isolation and authorship or writing. After Ibn Khaldun's return from Andalusia, he found politics very distasteful, with its conspiracies and with its intrigues. As such, he acted as if he accepted one of the assignments of the Prince of Tilmisan, and he sought refuge in the midst of one of the tribes with which he had strong ties. That was the tribe of Bani Arif. It must have been a very rich tribe that owned palaces, and it allowed Ibn Khaldun to stay in one of its palaces known as the Castle of Salama, and there he enjoyed peace and quiet and lived for 4 years. In this period, he wrote the introduction of his book, Kitab al-Ibar, and he started writing the first part, and he actually finished the whole work. The first plan of the work was to write the history of the Arabs and the Berbers. He didn't intend to write anything about the eastern part of the Muslim world because he didn't really have sufficient data. And his stay in the Castle of Salama was a great opportunity for him to pour his observations and to pour his experiences, all information that he was able to collect and organize, and in order to produce his intellectual thoughts, his important theories of political and social thought that were related to his name. Now, as a good researcher, as a good student, he must document his work, and he must try to confirm his citations, and he must try to confirm the sources from which he got his information. So he needed books, he needed sources, he needed to seek certain libraries. So he thought of returning to Tunis, and that was actually the first time he returned to Tunis ever after he left it for the first time in order to work for the service of the Sultan of Fas, if you remember. So he wanted to go to Tunis for this intellectual purpose. He sent a letter of apology to the Prince of Tunis, who became one of his enemies. That prince actually forgave him and allowed him to return to Tunis. Actually, he received him very well and even allowed him to invite his family that was staying with the tribe of Bani Arif. He allowed him to bring that family of his back to Tunis. And Ibn Khaldun started reworking and editing his work until he finished it, and actually he presented the first copy of his work to the Prince of Tunis. And because he was so much afraid that the Prince of Tunisia would give him political assignments, so he asked his permission to go to Mecca on a pilgrimage trip. And he went by sea to Egypt. Last semester we talked about Ibn Khaldun's life in Egypt, so we really needn't bother ourselves again with the details. However, all we need to say that Ibn Khaldun occupied prominent posts in Egypt, and he was also teaching in Al-Azhar Mosque and also in what is called Al-Madrasa Al-Qamhiyya, his political and social theories. And that was also kind of a period of isolation, not in the intellectual sense, but in the political sense, that although he occupied certain government posts, but he wasn't part of the political intrigues and the political conspiracies as he was in Tunisia and Morocco and in Andalusia. He was just working for the ruling authority, and he was giving his lessons, and he stayed like that until he heard that Tamerlane was sweeping the eastern part of the Muslim world, and he was in Syria. So he actually got out of his solitude, and he went and met Tamerlane, who admired the man Ibn Khaldun very much. And Ibn Khaldun recorded in his autobiography the talks between himself and Tamerlane. However, he left Tamerlane and returned to Egypt to die shortly afterwards. From this, we can see the richness of Ibn Khaldun's life on the personal level, and the amount of friendships and hostilities that he was able to cultivate on the political level, the amount of and number of posts, foreign missions that he made, the number of relations that he was able, and ties that he was able to cultivate with key politicians, with key tribesmen. And here we can see that when Ibn Khaldun was talking about matters of politics and social matters, he wasn't talking from the perspective of a theoretical thinker living in his ivory tower, like Al-Farabi, for instance, who followed the line of Plato, but he was taking the perspective of a statesman, of a clever and incisive politician who practiced politics and was part in the several conspiracies and intrigues, who practiced politics in reality, in real life. And this is why his theories still live until these days, and they have the explanatory power and the incisiveness that they enjoy, and as such they are still applied in present situations for explanation. شكرا جزيلا.